lo mandé hoy. I sent the sermons to the gentleman who is translating into Spanish, into the language of heaven. See, now I aggravated the English speakers. All right. Well, I guess we have the ones that are going to be in here. Let's have a word of prayer as we begin. Father in heaven, in this last presentation, we ask for the presence of your Spirit. We realize that there are trying times ahead, very difficult times, where your people, as many in the past, are going to lose everything in terms of material possessions, but we will have the most precious thing, and that is Jesus. We ask that you will keep us faithful to you, help us to be faithful now, so that when the trial comes, we will remain faithful. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. In our last presentation in this series, we are going to study what has been called the parable of the unjust judge. I don't like that title, so I gave it my own title. The title is The Parable of the Persistent Widow. I like that better, because at the center of the story is a widow. And so we're going to take a look at the parable in Luke 18, verse 1 through 8. Luke 18, verses 1 through 8. First thing we're going to do is read the parable. And I want you to, please, concentrate on the details. Try to visualize like you're there, seeing this yourself. Follow the sequence that we find in this passage. So Luke chapter 18, verse 1. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. In other words, never give up. Always pray, never give up. Saying, there was in a certain city a judge. So remember this, there's a city and there's a judge in the city who did not fear God nor regard man. In other words, this judge, secular judge. Now there was a widow. Okay, so we have a judge in the city, and now in the city there's a widow as well. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, to the judge, saying, get justice for me from my adversary. Also, there's an adversary of the widow here. And she's begging the judge to exercise justice against her adversary. Verse 4, there's a delay. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, that is, she's a pest, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them. God will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith in the earth? That's the parable. Now the question is, to what period of history does this parable apply? Well, first of all, it applies to all times, because it's always true that we always ought to pray and never give up. So it applies to all of human history. But we're going to find that it has a special application to those who will live in the final time of trouble on this earth after the close of probation. You say, how do we know that? Well, we need to take into account the context in which the parable appears. We need to look at what comes before, and we need to look at what comes after the parable. Before the parable, Jesus has been talking about his second coming. He says that as it was in the days of Noah, so also will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Then he says, as it was in the days of Lot, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So immediately before the parable, he's speaking about the second coming. And at the end of the parable, he speaks of the second coming. Because he says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith in the earth? And so this parable is sandwiched in between references to the second coming. So it applies specifically to that group who will be on planet Earth shortly before the second coming of Christ. Now, let's look at the elements of the parable, and then we're going to look at them more carefully. First of all, let's read about the judge. Notice Luke 18 and verse 2. There was in a certain city a judge. And notice it says that this judge did not fear God, nor regard man. That expression simply means that the judge was a secular man. He had no interest in religion. He was not a religious man. He just basically did his job as judge. It continues saying there in verse 3, now there was a widow in that city. Now the story clearly indicates that the widow had no children, because they would have stepped to the plate to help her, no house, no money, no friends, no attorney to represent her. She was in a precarious condition. Her only hope was found in the judge doing her justice over the adversary. Now, the widow was also persistent. She didn't give up. Notice once again Luke 18 and verse 3. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him. So the widow came to the judge. Now, the translation came does not capture the persistence of the widow. She didn't come once or twice or 3 times. She kept coming and coming and coming to the judge, and the judge kept putting her off and putting her off and putting her off. But she didn't give up. She was insistent and persistent. Now, when we go to verse 5, we see what came means. It's talking about coming and coming. Because in verse 5, the judge says, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. In other words, she had become a pest to the judge. She kept on coming and coming, and the judge eventually says, I give up. I'm going to do her justice to get her off my back. So that's what the judge does. But she is persistent and insistent. Now, in the story, there's also an adversary of the widow. It says there in Luke 18, verse 3 again, now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him persistently, saying to him, get justice for me from my adversary. So the widow has an adversary. Now, yes, those who have studied this parable, the scholars who have studied this parable, have concluded, and I believe that it's correct, that when this woman's husband died, he had a huge debt with a creditor. And he died, and he never paid his debt. And so the adversary simply cleaned out the widow, took everything that her husband had left in order to pay the debt that he had with the creditor. And so, we find this widow in a precarious condition. Now, the judge delayed in answer to her. It says in chapter 18 and verse 4, and he would not for a while. He delayed. She kept on coming and coming and coming. And he kept on putting her off and putting her off and putting her off. But then the judge said, I'm going to do this woman justice. Let's read chapter 18 and verse 4 once again. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. So eventually the judge did do her justice to get her off his back, because she had wearied him by coming and coming and coming persistently and insistently. He did her justice after the delay. Now Jesus then goes on to explain the parable. Notice verse 6. Now Jesus is going to explain the meaning of the parable. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. In other words, now I'm going to tell you what this parable really means. And shall God not avenge his own elect? So who does the judge represent? Who does the judge symbolize? He symbolizes God. If the judge did justice to the widow, shall not God do what? Avenge. Shall not God avenge his own elect? So who would the widow represent? The elect. Will not God, like the judge, avenge like the judge, his elect like the judge did the widow, who cry out day and night? Did the widow cry out day and night? Oh yeah. Cry out day and night to him, though he what? Though God bears long with them. There's a delay. Right? So we're going to interpret the symbols of this parable, what the symbols represent. Who does the judge represent? The judge represents God. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, wait a minute, Pastor. How can the judge represent God if we are told that the judge did not fear God nor regard man? How in the world can that judge represent God? The answer is that the judge represents God. It's a comparison by way of contrast. This is how it works out. If a judge that does not fear God nor regard man answers the pleas of a widow to get her off his back, how much more will God answer the pleas of his people because he loves them? In other words, the judge answers the pleas, and God answers the pleas, but for different reasons. The judge does it to get her off his back. God answers because he loves his people. So the parallel is in the fact that both listen and answer, but they answer for different reasons. Are you following me? So the judge represents God. Whom does the widow represent? Well, let me ask you this. What does a woman represent symbolically in the Bible? A woman represents the church. A pure woman represents what kind of church? A pure church. A harlot woman represents a fallen apostate church. Now I'm going to ask you a question that nobody has ever asked you. What does a widow woman represent? Because she's symbolic in the parable. What does a widow woman represent? Now clearly, she represents the church, but not under ordinary circumstances. The widow is oppressed. She's being tormented by an adversary who has cleaned her out and taken everything from her. The widow represents the church that is going through the final tribulation, the time of trouble. Satan has cleaned them out. They have nothing to lean on. They have lost everything. And they're going to cry out to God for justice over the adversary, for God to do them justice. In other words, the widow woman represents those who go through the final time of trouble. They have nothing to lean on. Their only hope is in their pleas to God, the judge. Now you say, Pastor, are you sure about that? I wouldn't say it if I wasn't sure. There's a key word that is used by Jesus in the parable. He says, shall not God avenge his own elect? That's a key word. It's the elect church at the end of time. Let me ask you, when are the elect going to live? Go with me, Matthew 24. And we'll read verse 21, 22, and then we'll read verse 24. Remember, the key word is elect. The elect will cry out day and night to the Lord to avenge them over the adversary. It says there, for then there will be great tribulation. This is the final time of trouble. You say, how do we know it's the last time of trouble? Because it says, great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. There's never been a time of trouble such as this, and there will never be a time of trouble such as this. It's the worst time of trouble in history. That's what it's telling us. Let me ask you, what is the worst time of trouble in the history of the world? It's called the time of Jacob's trouble. It is the great tribulation after the close of probation. So it says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, who's going to be going through that great tribulation? Verse 22. And unless those days, the days of the great tribulation, were shortened, what would happen? No flesh would be saved. In other words, everyone would perish if those days of the great tribulation were not shortened. But for whose sake? Is that name in the parable, elect? When are the elect going to live? During the great tribulation. The tribulation such as never has been, nor shall be. That's the great time of trouble. But it continues saying here, once again, verse 22, and unless those days of the great tribulation were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days of the great tribulation will be shortened. So when are the elect going to live? During the final great tribulation, such as has not been nor will be. That's the great time of trouble. And then let's read verse 24. Once again, the word elect is used. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So who is represented by the widow? The elect. Did the widow go through a terrible time of trouble? Did she lose everything, every human support? Are God's people going to live through a severe time of trouble? Are we going to lose every earthly support? Did the widow cry to the judge for justice? Are God's people going to cry out to God for justice in the great time of trouble? Yes. This parable is talking about end-time events. Not only that we should always pray and that we shouldn't give up. During that time, we're going to really have to pray, and we're not going to be able to give up. Now, at this time, God's people are going to have to leave everything behind. Notice Luke 17, 31 to 33. Luke 17, 31 to 33. Jesus says, in that day, when God's people are fleeing because of the great tribulation, he who is on the housetop and his goods are in his house, let not him come down to take them away. And likewise, the one who is in the field, let him not turn back. We're going to have to leave it all behind. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. Now, here's another question. Who is the adversary of the elect at the end time? Who is the adversary of the widow in the parable? The parable doesn't tell us. So if the parable doesn't tell us who the adversary is, we have to go to another place in the Bible where that word is used. If the symbol is not interpreted in the context, then we have to go to other places in the Bible where that word is used, adversary, antidikon in Greek. I'm sure you're acquainted with 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, where this identical word is used. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary... Oh, so who is the adversary that cleaned out the widow and will clean out the elect? The devil. Your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. By the way, when the woman had to flee to the wilderness in Revelation 12 and had to leave everything behind, who was the adversary that went after them and cleaned them out? The dragon. Is the dragon going to do that in a future persecution? We already studied in our previous presentation that there's going to be, the papacy is going to rise to power, and she's going to do what she did by cleaning out the church in the past. Only this is going to be after the close of probation. Now, what did the widow do? She lost everything. The adversary cleaned her out. But she comes to the judge and cries out, and cries out, and cries out for the judge, in this case God, to do justice. Now listen carefully to what I'm going to say. I looked up in the writings of Ellen White the expression cry out day and night. The expression that's used in the parable. Every single time that Ellen White uses the expression cry out day and night, she's using it in the context of the time of trouble after the close of probation. I'm going to give you one example. Early writings, page 36 and 37. By the way, let's not get attached to our stuff. We get so attached to our stuff. Listen, we have so much stuff that God could not take us out of the world with the most powerful crane in the world. Let's invest in God's cause. Everything that's not absolutely necessary. You say, how do I invest in the cause? You invest in the cause by using your resources, your health, and using your financial resources, using your talents to invest in preparing yourself and preparing others for this time of tribulation and for the second coming of Christ. Let's be heavenly focused. You've heard the expression, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. Well, the opposite works too. You're so earthly minded that you're no heavenly good. Let's invest in God's cause. Notice this statement, Early Writings 36 and 37. Ellen White wrote, I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary. And then will come the 7 last plagues. So Jesus finishes his work in the sanctuary, then the plagues, the 7 plagues fall. Then she writes, these plagues enrage the wicked against the righteous. There's the adversary. They thought that we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and if they could rid us from the earth, the plagues would then be stayed. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. So when is this time going to be? It's when the plagues are falling after the close of probation. And then she finishes the statement by saying, this was the time of Jacob's trouble. There it's clear. Then all the saints cried out with anguish of spirit and were delivered by the voice of God. Are you understanding when this parable applies? When do we start preparing for this? When we get there, we say, oh, emergency. No, now we prepare, putting our priorities in order. By the way, that expression, cry out, is a very intense, it's actually one word in Greek. It's a very intense, agonizing word. There are many words for crying out in the New Testament, but this is the strongest. For example, it's used when the evil spirits saw the apostles, they cried out in anguish because they knew the apostles were going to cast them out. It's used of a father who cried out to Christ to heal his tormented young boy. It's used when Jesus cried out to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's used for a woman crying out with birth pangs. That's the way the cry of God's people will be. And that's the way that the widow cried out. But here's the important point. God's people will cry out day and night, but God will not answer immediately. There will be a delay. God will delay to answer their pleas. The notable Presbyterian Bible commentator, Albert Barnes, wrote this about the experience of the people during that period. Although God defers long to avenge them. God defers what? Long to avenge them. And greatly tries their patience. Yet he will avenge them. He tries their faith. Tries means he tests. He tries their faith. He suffers their persecutions and trials to continue a long time. He's going to allow trials and persecutions to go for a long time. And it almost appears as if he would not interpose. Yet he will do it and will save them after a delay. By the way, God will not allow the delay to go full course. He's going to shorten the period. It'll be long, but if God didn't shorten it, nobody would remain alive. And so because of the elect, out of love for the elect, God is going to shorten that period of anguish. Now the question is, why will God delay? If God loves his people, why doesn't he deliver them immediately? For two reasons. First of all, God allows them to go through this period, through the furnace, so that they will come forth as pure gold. In other words, his purpose in allowing them to go through this period is to settle their faith for eternity and their trust in God for eternity. Notice Job. By the way, did Job suffer a terrible time of trouble? We'll come back to this later. Did the adversary wipe him out? Did Job cry out to the judge? Did God delay? Job is an illustration of this parable. And he's an illustration of what will happen to God's people in the end time. We'll come back to Job in a little while. So the first reason why God will allow his people to go through this period, the elect to go through this period, is he wants them to go through the furnace to totally purge their earthliness. Ellen White doesn't say their worldliness, because when probation closes, God's people will not be worldly. She uses the word earthliness. Everything that attaches us to this earth. And he will allow us to go through this period to refine us and to purify us so that when we come forth as pure gold. Job understood that. In Job 23 verse 10, Job said, when he was going through his trial, "But God knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold." Job knew why he was going through this. Yes, God is testing me. I'm going to come forth as pure gold with no dross. In Isaiah 48 and verse 10, we are told, God is speaking, "Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." Listen, if we get discouraged over the silly stuff that happens to us these days, what makes us think that we're going to be able to pass this huge test in the future? Let's not allow the petty things in life to discourage us. The trials that we suffer now are preparing us for the great trials during the time of trouble. You know, the experience